Because sometimes we think that anxiety can go away. But I like when we say manage. Anxiety will not go away. It's knowing how to manage when it appears, when it comes up. Welcome back to another episode of Revolutionary Detox. For those that don't know me, my name is Misalignment, and I am so happy that you're here with us today. I am so excited once again because I have a special guest that's coming to talk about how to manage anxiety. I don't know about you, but when I hear that, I feel so ready because in this time of era that we're living, anxiety is one of the biggest and number one issues that humans and people are experiencing. So please help me welcome my guest, Partha. Partha, thank you for coming.
I'm really grateful to you for inviting me. I'm really honored.
Thank you. So why don't you introduce yourself a little bit to the audience, your background, what do you do?
Sure. So I'm a computer scientist by profession. I'm serving as an engineering director at MathWorks. And apart from that, I'm also teaching in the computer science department of Tufts University.
Wow.
And then in Brandeis and Northeastern, I serve as a spiritual advisor. So that's where my whole discussion about the topic of anxiety and caring about the students, that aspect comes in.
Well, I honestly think he's the perfect person to talk about it because you do so many things at once. I remember when I met you, I said you remind me of Amazon. You're Amazon in person. You do it all and you have it all. So thank you so much for coming. So when we met each other at, it was like a practice or...
It was one of the meetings in Brandeis University where we were discussing overcoming negative emotions in general.
Exactly. And I honestly fell in love with the way you break down anxiety and you break down the steps on how to manage anxiety. Because sometimes we think that anxiety can go away. But I like when we say manage. Anxiety will not go away. It's knowing how to manage when it appears, when it comes up. So why don't you take it away?
Excellent point you just made. While we are living in this world, which around us we can find all the time having two basic characteristics. Everything around us is temporary. Consider objects, consider relationship, everything is temporary. And therefore, the first characteristic of the situations around us is that it is essentially temporary, and the second characteristic is that therefore naturally it brings misery, because as eternal spiritual being, we have a natural tendency to look for things eternal, and we want things to be there around us. And you can see that even when we are making a plan, we make 5-year plan, 10-year plan, as if we are going to live forever, And that kind of shows that, actually intuitively we carry the notion that I'm eternal, And that's actually true. That's not actually a false understanding, that's a true understanding. But that's not pertaining to this outer covering of this material body. That pertains to our essential nature, our spiritual self. And most of the time, we are disconnected from that spiritual self. And so anxiety is kind of a reflection of our unawareness of our spiritual self. So when we are disconnected from our real spiritual self, and when we embrace the temporary conditions in this material world, we embrace anxieties associated with it.
That's perfectly said. When we embrace the materialistic and the things, external matter, we embrace anxiety. Because anxiety it intertwines with that.
Yes.
So what would be your advice on how to manage that?
Right. So that's why, as you said, the question of managing the anxiety comes in, because there are situations around us which are going to stimulate conditions of anxiety, So before we can get into understanding how we can manage anxiety, it is important for us to, first of all, understand a little bit at a root cause level how anxiety is generated. And I like to say that anxiety is actually generated because of a misalignment between two levels of our identity. So let's talk about the two levels of misalignment. So before I can talk about the misalignment, let me talk about when we look at ourselves, like what is our identity, generally we are living through pretty much two basic aspect of our existence. One is this bodily aspect, like the body made up of basic physical senses, and the second aspect is the subtle, the mind, you know. So mind, intelligence, ego, these are the subtle aspect, you know. But then there is a spiritual aspect which is the soul proper, you know. So we have this kind of, so to speak, tripartite existential reality. You can say the spiritual existence, which is coming forth from, as you said, from the soul proper, and then there is the emotional aspect, which is coming forth from the mind, and then there is the physical existence, which is basically the body, the gross physical body, how we are identifying with various senses that the body is made up of. So the misalignment that I'm talking about occurs between the physical reality that is presented around us and the emotional reality that is within us, the expectations, the stored imprints that we carry from the past. So when we are living in this world, we live through those expectations. In other words, we are always on a constant search for the past good experiences that we had, and we look for stimuli in this world and see, can I repeat those past experiences, you know? And when the reality around us, they don't really match up, then it creates a misalignment. That's one level of misalignment. The second level of misalignment is because the mind itself generates so many ideas of enjoyment which may not be in sync with our spiritual self. Because as a spiritual self, it can be happy regardless of the external circumstances. Because the spirit soul is considered to be a part and parcel of God. And because the spirit soul is part and parcel of God, the real happiness is within the relationship that the soul has eternally with God. And having forgotten that, you know, it creates all kinds of false expectations, varieties of dreaming situations in this world. And then that gap between the emotional state and the actual spiritual self, that is the second level of misalignment. And they lead to anxiety. So the managing anxiety is all about managing these two misalignments and how can we effectively do that. And overall, this anxiety surfaces at the level of our mind, ultimately. And mind is extremely powerful in actually creating, you can say, hell out of heaven or heaven out of hell. You know?
Woo, perfectly said. So when we tap into our mindset, because it seems that the core of managing anxiety starts here.
Correct.
When we tap into our mindset, what would be that step?
Correct. So first of all, the mind, if it can gradually be attuned to realistic expectations, you know, how it can match up with the reality around, then there is a sort of tempering of the emotions because of that. You know, if suppose like I expect to get something really beyond our reach, you know, and then I really am hankering, you know, hoping that I will get. But when that doesn't get through, it creates a tremendous amount of anxiety. But if we are able to see that, okay, most of the things are not in our control, and therefore we don't know how things are going to play. And therefore, to somehow or other adjust that high expectation that we carry about the situations of this world, that can help manage to some extent.
That makes me get to, I remember when I met you, you talked about the power of the mind and how a person literally died because of the anxiety they created through their thoughts.
Yes.
Do you want to talk a little bit about
definitely.
that?
I'll share with you a couple of examples actually in that regard. So one example, as you just reminded me of, so there was a person who used to work in German railways, and he was a technician. So one time in the afternoon, he started working in the pantry car of a particular railway compartment. And then he was so busy, he didn't keep track of time. And then he all of a sudden found that he is working inside the refrigerator unit within the pantry car. And then he was the only person trapped in this whole boggy of the train. And then he was so much struck with anxiety just thinking about dying there because he's stuck inside the refrigerator.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, next day he was found dead.
Mm.
But this interesting part of this story is that there was no electricity.
The whole time is gone.
So therefore there was no actual refrigerator in the working mode, and therefore his death is not so much about the external condition. It is about his mind getting into that state of anxiety that I'm going to die.
Mm-hmm.
And that emotion was so overpowering that it actually resulted in death.
Dying. Oh my goodness.
And therefore we should be very much cautious about what kind of thoughts we are harboring, Like if we from time to time we think, I might get cancer, And it may happen that I will actually get cancer, because these thoughts are very powerful. They think about these thoughts are like strong energy bubbles, energy bundles of energy that are getting generated, coming out of our mind. Yeah. And it is said that on average, or an average person on a daily basis generates close to 72,000 thoughts.
Oh my goodness.
So you can imagine.
Imagine if 70,000
how much amount of bundles of energy are we dealing with? So that better be directed in the positive direction, in the realistic direction.
So I would ask you a question, because some people say, if you're very optimistic, it can be bad. And if you're obviously pessimistic, it can be obviously bad. So what would be your advice on how to have a balance of these thoughts of accepting reality, but this, because obviously reality can be, exerting negative forces towards you, but how can you still be I'm asking you?
Yes, definitely. So generally, like when we are living through this world, there are certain information that comes through our experience, and then there are certain information that we learn from the scriptures. So, for example, Bhagavad Gita is considered to be one of the greatest scriptures coming from the Eastern tradition. So, according to the Bhagavad Gita, it paints the reality about this material world, and it says that the nature of this place is dukkhalayam and ashashvatam, that it is temporary and full of misery. So when we hear that, we at least kind of adjust our understanding of this place and not carry a sort of like a wishful thinking that maybe for me things might change, And there is an interesting incident that happens many years ago. There are 5 wise brothers, who were just in the middle of the forest, and they were very thirsty. And it so happened that that there was a voice that they heard, and they were just in the vicinity of a reservoir of water. And when he heard that voice, when he, meaning the elder one, he tried to stop everyone and let's pay attention to what that voice is saying. And the voice said, stop, don't try to drink this water, otherwise you will all be dead.
Oh jeez.
And the others could not control. They drank the water and then they were out of consciousness. So this brother was very wise, the eldest one. His name was Yudhishthir. And so he tried to pay attention to what the voice had to say. So then, one by one, this voice from the sky was asking some very interesting questions, And if he satisfactorily answers all the questions, then he would bring all his brothers back to life, and also he will allow them to drink the water. So it was a test, One of the questions that was asked was very interesting. He asked that, what is the most wonderful thing that you find in this world? Most wonderful thing. And his response was that the most wonderful thing in this world is that we all the time hear about death, Like you can see newspaper every day, there are news about death coming in. But in spite of the fact that we see death all around, somehow or other I carry this sort of conviction that maybe I'm not going to die. So I'm just giving you an example of like what is the level of wonderment with which we live in this material world. So now you're talking about optimistic. Say, yes, like if we are just too pessimistic, we are always thinking about I'm going to die, that creates a certain kind of anxiety as well. And so how am I going to live? Like if all the time I'm just thinking about death, So how do we actually balance with a reasonable amount of optimism and also think about where we are headed for? So for that, it is important for us to tap into knowledge. We have to be aware of, first of all, who we are. So if we understand that I am an eternal spirit soul, nothing to do with discovering, so likewise we can understand that actually that concept itself is going to generate tremendous amount of optimism. Because if I'm an eternal spirit soul, then death is only happening to this body. So the question is that what can I do so that my future, even beyond this particular life, how can I make that brighter? So the whole focus and attention shifts from just the temporary conditions of this material world to start thinking about how to paint a much long-term future for myself. And to the extent I'm able to align my activities in terms of that vision, we have now already made a switch of absorption. So instead of figuring out how to just make this world a super happy place, which is very difficult task because everything is just temporary. So how can I actually, first of all, act from the point of knowledge and help others also come to that position of knowledge, So then the mission, just like you are doing, your mission is also kind of helping others grow, internally. So you're giving them some tools and tips by which they can actually operate from a higher level of consciousness. And you're dedicating your life for that purpose. So you have a purpose in mind, and because of having a purpose beyond the normal and ordinary sort of things, that gives you a sense of happiness from within you, which others cannot actually access, So it's basically about becoming more purpose oriented. Another important thing to keep in mind is that the human beings have a certain kind of prerogative which actually animals may not have. And the human beings, there's one interesting characteristic of a human being is that they always try to beat their own potential, They always are trying to rise above the ordinary. That's why you see like people are trying to figure out how they can fly in the sky, They're looking at the birds and say, I want to fly. So human beings always have a tendency to beat the ordinary state of affairs. And that's because they are meant for that purpose. They're not meant to be kind of getting bound by the physical laws that are just operating around. They're meant to transcend that. And actually we have been given that potential to do that. So if we recognize those aspects, then our goal actually shifts beyond the ordinary. And the life's mission accordingly gets directed in that direction. And as a result of which, now that whole pessimistic worldview completely switches because I have got a change of absorption. So that's the basic idea. So how I can connect with the true purpose of life, true mission of life.
And when you say that, I think about authenticity. I think about one being intentional to be their true self.
Exactly.
And how can someone be able to tap into their authentic self, who they're meant to be?
So just like you are doing, you're taking pause, right, from the regular affairs of life. So we all need to actually take a pause and reflect. Like we need to have time for self-reflection. We need to have time to actually dig into wealth of knowledge that are given by our scriptures. And when we connect with those wealth of knowledge, then what happens is that it actually empowers us with certain wisdom which is just impossible for us to get just through mental speculation, And therefore we bring ourselves in connection with those wisdom literatures like Bhagavad Gita. And that actually produces a different level of intelligence. That's basically defining a path of clarity. And along with that, wisdom literatures like Bhagavad Gita, they also profess some practices, some timeless practices. By following those timeless practices, one can actually pave also a path of purity. So we need simultaneously a path of clarity and a path of purity. Because our heart generally is always filled with a lot of filth, filth lust, anger, greed, envy, pride, illusion. These are always there, inflicting our pure consciousness.
Wow.
And therefore, we need to also have a mechanism, we need to have a process by which we can purify our mind. So there is a path of clarity and there is a path of purity. And these two tracks essentially form like a railway track on which we walk down,
Yes, and you become your true, authentic self.
Yes. So it has to be worked on, essentially. It's not going to come for free.
Exactly. And that was my other question, that people think you just instantly get it.
Yes.
It's a process, something that you have to constantly be working and risking and sacrifice.
Exactly.
Number one. So my other question would be in terms of anxiety and the actual steps then. And those things you talked about when I met you, in terms of that, tying everything back together of those steps, do you mind?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
So now let's go back to that misalignment we talked about.
Exactly. To now wrap it all up.
So let's tackle the misalignment between the emotional layer and the physical layer, So before that, let's just give a simple analogy, just so that the audience can connect with it.
Yes.
Because I'm coming from a computer science background,
Exactly.
I appreciate this particular analogy
Me too.
very much. Exactly. So think like if you have a computer, So a computer has got a hardware and a software.
Mm-hmm.
And then there is a user of the computer.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So hardware is important, Now you may have a computer with the best possible hardware, but if the software is corrupted, doesn't matter how good your hardware is, it's not going to work.
Mm-hmm.
So this hardware is compared to our physical reality, this physical body, just like hardware. So we can have a stout body, healthy body, all kinds of things, Software is compared to our mind. So if you have a healthy body, but if the mind is corrupted, if my mind is infected with viruses, just like I was saying, lust, anger, greed, etc., then we would not be able to function properly. Okay? So there is this hardware of this body, then there is a software which you cannot see, right? It is subtle, and that's our mind. And likewise, we also have our spiritual self. So if the spiritual self is like the user who is using these faculties, there is the mind and the body. Okay. So now mind is a storehouse for varieties of imprints and various emotional responses and expressing varieties of desires and so on and so forth. And therefore, the desires that are coming forth from the mind can be of all kinds of shapes and forms, depending on the past situations that the mind has been exposed to. Not only in this lifetime, it could happen in previous lifetimes, which we don't even know.
Exactly. Traumas.
Traumas, exactly. So in order to actually bring the mind in harmony with the physical reality, so first, as I said, it needs to be aware of the conditions around, and therefore it needs to have a realistic sort of understanding of the place where the mind is. The second aspect is that I would like to give a sort of like a formula to live with, to kind of how to actually make that realistic. So call it CAR. So when we are faced with different situations of life, we should try to approach, the first principle should be we try to control what is really controllable. Okay, that's the C. And what is not controllable, you accept. And what is not acceptable, you try to recede yourself from that.
I love it. Control, accept, receive.
Yes.
I love it. So why
this is how you try to make it realistic.
Why don't you expand more on car?
So, as you can see that oftentimes our tendency is to forget what is our actually range of control or control or influence. We tend to actually go into the area of concern, So the first thing is that we have to understand that what is really within my control. Okay, that's the C part, And then after we have done that analysis, then we find that there are so many things which are not actually within our control. What do? Only thing we can do is accept. So part of acceptance is also tolerance. And when we actually accept, that acceptance itself is quite empowering. Like for example, if there is a very unwanted sort of situation that is in front of us, if we do not accept, then what happens is that it generates a lot of anger in us. But if we accept it, that same situation turns into an adventure. So I'm just giving you an example, like where you can see that acceptance can be very empowering. But at the same time, there could be situations which are actually I'm noticing that it is beyond me to accept. So what do? So I can do two things. I can definitely receive, and at the same time I can also pray. Prayers are very powerful, and prayers can be powerful enough to even change the situation.
And I like that, because when I think of CAR, of your method, I think about the combination about not being complacent. When you accept something, that doesn't mean that you're complacent.
Correct.
Because maybe the audience right now might be thinking, okay, I like the control part, right? If I cannot control it, I'm not going to control it. But then when he got to the accept part, then you're like, wait, but there's some things that I'm definitely not going to accept. And that's okay. It's about not being complacent and staying put in that area, right? That it's not tolerable. So that's why I agree so much with you about then retrieving, getting out, withdrawing yourself. And of course, there are things that you want to access, whether that is something that you can pray for, something that you can be hopeful that there could be change, because there's also that aspect of knowing when is that okay to do, when is it okay for me to step away, right? Because you don't want to seem like someone that just gives up.
Exactly.
So I like the formula of CAR, but I like it with everything else that Partha touched upon on how to. That's the cherry on top, right?
Yeah.
So
let me just bring also to the second level of misalignment. So this is the misalignment that we are treating between the emotional state of affairs,
right,
the mind and the physical reality.
Right.
So now let's talk about the misalignment that exists between the mind's different varieties of thoughts and emotions that are becoming the primary cause for us to become entrapped in this world. Right? So how does that actually, or how can we bring some modification at that level? And for that we need to evolve our consciousness. I was saying that's the path of purity. So as you can see now, you can map the path of clarity and the path of purity to this. So the path of clarity is basically having the realistic expectations and trying to temper our response in relation to that. And the path of purity is to help ourselves evolve, through some bona fide spiritual process, whether it is mantra meditation, whether it is getting into some yoga practices with some internalization of emotions, So applying some processes by which we can actually clear up our mind,
Yes.
remove all those impurities around. And then there will be a perfect alignment.
Exactly. That reminds me of tapping into the higher power.
Exactly.
Tapping into the higher power. Just because we are running out of time, I want to thank Partha for coming in. Where can people find you, if there's anywhere that you would like people to access?
So there is a website called divinemindfulness.com. I would ask your audience to visit there, because there is a lot of interesting anecdotes that are shared there, and also my contact address is also there.
Awesome. Thank you all for tuning in. I hope you found this valuable. I honestly, this man, I just appreciate all the knowledge and wisdom that you pour out. Thank you for coming.
I'm really grateful to you for all your time.
Thank you so much, brother. Thank you all, and have a good day.